Hi, I wanted to thank you for the chance to tell this story. You know, when I watch the news, I get overwhelmed. What am I supposed to do? What can I do about Korea? Immigration? Is the government ever going to start again? And when I begin to feel that way, I binge watch Nessun. I've not been able to figure that out, but it doesn't accomplish anything for anyone. So when I begin to slide that way, when I've got the remote in my hand, I think about stories my dad told me. Now, I'm 66 years old, and if you're my age, you grew up on stories of the Great Depression. My dad would tell us stories. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother, and he would tell us stories about the Great Depression. Some of them were true, some were meaningful, and some were both. His parents had been well-to-do before the economy tanked, and they enjoyed spending money. So that when the you-know-what hit the fan, they had no savings, and they had really no way to feed their 5 sons or clothe them. My grandfather tried to work, started a small business, but whenever he had money, he spent it on other people, bought a few rounds of drinks in a few bars, and spread his affection among other families, which caused difficulty between he and my grandmother, and obviously for my dad. My dad told us that when he was in the 1st grade, he would walk to school. It was about a block, and he'd walk home for lunch. Now, the reason the 6-year-olds in 1929 would walk home is so they could be with their mothers, and the mother would say, "Don't worry, you can take care of it. 2 + 2 is 4. Stop fighting with Jack. Do what the teacher says." And then at 1 o'clock, they could restart the class. And my dad would do that, and sometimes it would work out. But sometimes he'd come home, and his mother would say, "There's no food." And when she said there was no food, she didn't mean there was no food you like. She meant there was no food. And those were bad days. But there were worse. Sometimes he would come home, and there would be no food, and his mother would be rearranging the family's possession because there was no way to pay the rent. And he would go back to school. Now, Dad was hungry, and he never ended up homeless. He ended up living in a couple places, but he was never homeless. He repeated the 1st grade. And if you asked him why he repeated the 1st grade, he would say, "Well, I was in a car accident. I was out of school for about 2 weeks." And I always thought that was hooey. I mean, what 6-year-old, whether in 1929 or in 2019, who doesn't know where they're going to sleep at night, really cares if A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y, are vowels? None. Dad told us about 3 folks who helped him during this time. I don't know their first names. I only know their last names. 2 of them were the Ronins. Now, they lived a block or 2 over. They didn't have any children living with them, and they had a plum tree. And the Ronins said to the Anderson boys, "Hey, you can eat any plums you find on the ground." It was very generous of them. A few days after they said that, they had to revise the rule and say, "You can't shake the tree." But Dad would talk about, at night, if there was a thunderstorm or a windstorm came through when there were plums on the tree, breakfast at the Ronins in the morning. Nothing was better than that. The other person who helped them was Mrs. Shine. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Shine lived next to my grandparents, and Mr. Shine did not like my grandfather. I do not know why. But he said, "The Anderson boys cannot come into my yard under any reason, for any circumstance. Not to retrieve a baseball, not to get a dog, for no reason at all." On the boundary between the Shine and Anderson homes, my grandmother and grandfather had a standalone garage, and it had a window. Now, that window looked out over an apple tree. Mrs. Shine had the same view as Mr. Shine, but she had a different vision. So when fishing nets appeared under the apples and shook them free, she didn't see it. When rakes and shovels were whacking at the limbs to knock the apples tree free and drag them back across the property line, she never saw them. And when Mr. Shine would come home at night and he would say, "Were those Andersons in my yard?" she would say, "No, they were not." Now, Dad died in January 2017, and he was pretty much with it until a day or 2 before he died. If you asked him about the Ronins or the Shines, he would tell you essentially the same story that I told you. he would smile when he said it. Now, maybe the adjectives and the adverbs would be a little different, but he would tell you the same story. He remembered 87 years afterwards. But these people gave him green apples and bruised plums. But what they really gave him was hope. Now, I don't think many of us are called on to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi or Martin Luther King. We're called on to do small things. Thanks.